Boom. Setting up your webinar for Facebook Live. And I really feel like Facebook Live is an essential part of Facebook Live is the meandering moments of people attempting to decide what they're going to do and if they're really live and all that kind of stuff. But
you should just develop like a song and dance that is done in those interim moments so that whomever is starting to sign on and watch catches that in that awkwardness.
I know I could just sing and stuff.
I just like it when influencers and they're starting the Facebook Live, they're like, okay, so we're just waiting now. I see Jane and I see Jill and I see Max. Welcome. It is great to have you. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us.
Oh, well, I don't really feel obligated to wait for anybody, but I would just like to say that, my name is Trip and I'm sitting here with two of my friends.
For anybody, but I would just
see someone just hit play on Facebook. So someone just hit play and turn your volume off your phones.
With two of my friends. For anybody, but I would just see someone just hit.
Look, does anyone know where that came from at all? That's great. I'm glad the internet's helping us out. All of a sudden I was like, and I'm hearing myself talking. All right.
Better or more scary than two of each of us?
3. But ladies and gentlemen, my name is Trip. We're here. We're doing a Facebook Live, and I'm with my friends, Anna and Dave. What's up?
Hi, friends.
Hello.
So, Dave, you and I were talking about all the different types of conversations that the movie The Road to Edmond's been opening up and things, and people have been reaching back going, I did not expect that to happen after we screened this film and stuff. And I was like, you do know we hung out with like a professional at said giftedness at Theology Beer Camp, Anna, and then we're like, let's do a Facebook Live. And then what happens? We put that out in the spiritual ethers, and it's happening right now, right here on this Facebook feed.
Wow.
Crazy. Anna, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we've got North Carolina, California, and Tennessee all combining in one screen. I love it. Lots of goodness. Anna, for those who don't know you, take us on a little journey. Like, how did you get into ministry? What was your on-ramp to this world?
Yeah, so that conversation is a few minutes or a few hours, depending on how in depth you want me to get. I'll choose the few minutes version. So I was born and raised in a little town in the northern Shenandoah Valley of Virginia called Stevens City, which is near Winchester. Winchester's more known for folks that are from that area. And I was baptized in the same church that I grew up in and that I was a member of until I moved to Chattanooga 9 years ago. I'm what's considered a cradle United Methodist. My parents, brought me home from the hospital and I was at church the next Sunday. And so, and that church is the church where my family is multi-generational. My grandparents and great-grandparents, many generations of my family have been a part of that United Methodist Church. And so my Wesleyan roots run really deep. I was always in leadership at that church, chairing committees, chairing the trustees, leading and teaching Sunday school, any kind of leadership opportunity that you could give me, I took advantage of. But ministry was absolutely off limits, never on my radar, never even something that I would consider or even thought was a possibility for me. It wasn't a call that I felt that I had. And so, like I said, 9 years ago, I moved to Chattanooga and moved down here for the corporate job that I had. And through a series of events, started attending the church that is about 2 blocks from my house. It was a dying congregation, like many of our congregations are, full of aged folks, folks who had done a lot of hard work and had seen the congregation through a lot of ups and downs. But this congregation was really on its last leg. And through a series of serendipitous events, several of us came together to start a real intentional revitalization process in this church. It's in the heart of a kind of growing urban area. The neighborhood is full of everything from college students to retirees who have lived here for 40 years, families with young children, tattoo artists, bands, I mean, you name it, kind of this neighborhood had that diversity. And so when the revitalization of St. Mark's Church happened, I was part of the team that led us into that. There were about 15 committed members of the church when we first got there. I mean, they were really not doing well. And we worked through a process with this team where we kind of replanted virtually this United Methodist Church in this neighborhood. And at one point, and this happened about 6 years ago, at one point, there were as many as 180 to 190 folks on a weekly basis here. So really beautiful kind of spiritual growth in this neighborhood, in this community. And the process of revitalization actually caused us to all be unpaid staff persons. And so for the first several years of the revitalization of this church, not a single one of us was paid a salary. There was no paid pastor. We had a pastor that was kind of appointed by our conference, but he too was not taking a salary. We were all kind of giving our gifts to this ministry. And it was through that work that I really started to kind of hear God like, hello, I've been here all along and you keep like not listening, and I'd really love for you to like start paying attention, Anna. And so I was still working in a corporate world, and I decided that the local licensed process for the United Methodist Church was the best way for me to go. I wasn't at a point where I could kind of quit my job and go to seminary to get my MDiv, but I was able to pursue licensing through the United Methodist Church, which really gives me full connection and full appointment possibilities through the UMC, other than not being able to be ordained as an elder or a deacon. And so I went through this process and was appointed to my home congregation, which doesn't always happen. The pastor that was there transitioned out and they transitioned me in. And so alongside of another pastor, he and I started pastoring St. Mark's together. And then we were given a second congregation here in Chattanooga, and we started pastoring St. Elmo United Methodist Church together. And so for about a year, we worked with these two churches in tandem and kind of did this work as co-pastors here in Chattanooga. And so that's kind of the short version of my entree into ministry.
That's great. That's great. The things that come to mind are you're known for a level of activism in the area. So when did that kind of become part of your life? Was that something that began to emerge as a young person? You saw that modeled for you, or is it more recently?
So it has been more recent. However, I've always been a bit of a big mouth. my mom's watching, she's laughing right now. I am trained as a graphic designer. That was my undergrad degree, which means I went to art school, which means I was hanging out in my late teens, early 20s with all kinds of beautiful artists and musicians and theater majors and people who, quite frankly, were not like the me that came from Stephen City, Virginia. But I was introduced to this beautiful culture of diversity, specifically as it relates to LGBTQIA folks. And so it was in my undergrad days that I really started to have an understanding of the ways in which our queer friends are minimized, the ways in which they're hindered, the ways in which their lives aren't honored as their own.
Where did you go to undergrad?
I went to Shepherd College, which is a little liberal arts school in the panhandle of West Virginia.
Okay.
And so my activism really started there. Just kind of speaking up, seeing things I didn't like and challenging folks on them. In my 20s and 30s in a much more, I don't want to like hurt your feelings and I still want you to like me. So I'm not going to be too like in your face, but have you thought about this kind of way? It was really in my late 30s that I put that approach away and said, you know, none of us are going to see any good come in the world unless we actually speak truth into what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. And that really started for me along the time of the Iraqi war and the ways in which I really felt like the Bush presidency wasn't doing us any favors. And so that was really kind of where things got turned on for me from an activism standpoint. But even then I wasn't in the streets. I was writing, I was, putting Facebook posts and tweets out that, just like picked at people and made people think. And, but that's really what spawned my work in the queer community. And so one thing that I should mention is when we revitalized St. Mark's, we revitalized it with an absolute intention that it would be an open and affirming community of faith for LGBTQIA folks. Unashamed, unequivocally, without question, a place where the people of Chattanooga who had been kicked out of their congregations, who had been told by their parents or their pastors that they were going to hell because they were gay, could come and find a safe place to be in the midst of Jesus.
And so for your understanding of that, from looking at the scriptures or whatever, is that something that you were brought up with an understanding of inclusion or open and affirming, or is that something that you came to? Help me understand that.
Yeah, so that was definitely an evolution for me. I remember a conversation that I had with one of my dearest friends in undergrad. One night we were sitting around drinking beer in the dorm rooms and talking about, and he is gay, and talking about being gay. And I made this statement that today I just find so shocking. And I'm still so appalled by. I said, well, everybody has a different kind of sin. And if that's your sin, then that's perfectly fine. My sin is that I don't even remember what I said at that point. But I thought, I'm like, you're cool. I'm cool. I'm totally fine with your lifestyle, which I thought it was at that moment, a lifestyle, not a life, a being. And so it has been an evolution for me. The church I was raised in would not consider themselves to be liberal. They also wouldn't consider themselves to be super conservative. We got a female pastor in the 90s, which was unheard of even though the United Methodist Church started ordaining women in the late 60s, there were still a lot of churches that didn't want women in the pulpit. And she had a hard time. And I remember kind of watching this happened. So we were a church that kind of straddled the edge. That's how I was brought up. But it has really been over the last 20 years for me that I've dug really deeply into scripture, that I've wrestled with what it really means to be a Christian and be fully affirming and loving of people regardless of how they identify. And it also took me doing a lot of scientific and research on, well, what do the scientists say about being gay? I mean, that happened, probably 10 or 15 years ago, where I started to realize, there is nothing wrong with these friends of mine. There's nothing about them that is inherently bad.
Mm-hmm.
Their makeup and their being and the ways in which their DNA is constructed is not at all a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it was a blend of scripture and science that forced me to reckon with the evolutionary arc of my understanding of who people are and their worth.
Mm-hmm. And as you were as you were restarting St. Mark's, and there was an intentionality about being open and affirming, what did the local other area Methodist churches and the bishop, how did they approach that issue with you?
So our conference was supportive of us. They were fine with us being a congregation that is open and affirming. In the United Methodist Church, there is a lobbying arm of the church called Reconciling Ministries. And the Reconciling Ministries organization within the UMC kind of sets themselves up to be a support system for congregations like St. Mark's. Churches or individual Sunday school classes can actually sign on to state publicly that they are a part of the reconciling movement within the UMC, which gives them the ability to kind of market themselves as a church where people that might not feel like they have a home at more conservative UMCs can go. And so we identified ourselves as that pretty quickly. An interesting statistic, so St. Mark's and where I live here in Chattanooga is a part of the Holston Conference in the United Methodist Church. And Holston extends from kind of way down in Chattanooga where I am, all the way up into southeast or southwestern Virginia, kind of the Radford, Abington area, and kind of covers Knoxville. It's kind of the eastern third of Tennessee. There are more than 850 United Methodist churches in that conference.
Wow.
There are 3 reconciling congregations. St. Mark's is one of them. The other congregation that I pastored, St. Elmo, is the second. And then there is one at Emory and Henry University up in Abington, Virginia. So out of all of those churches, there are 3 identified reconciling congregations. Now there are others that have a posture of welcome and a posture of inclusion. There are Sunday school classes within churches that have said we are reconciling, but 3 overall congregations that are reconciling, and I pastored 2 of them. And so, even for Chattanooga, that was a big deal. I mean, we are in the buckle of the Bible Belt. We are a city that is a little different than the area around us. We tend to be a little bit more liberal overall, but I'm telling you, there were naysayers from the beginning. We were in the news a lot for all the cool stuff we were doing, and there were a lot of folks that were really up in arms about the fact that we were the gay church doing this work, and how dare us tell the people that were entering our doors that they were okay. And so both of these congregations, St. Mark's and St. Elmo, are about 50% LGBTQIA and 50% straight ally. We find that most folks that aren't willing to consider themselves an ally or work towards allyship don't find themselves comfortable in those congregations. And so there are a lot of other United Methodist churches that may feel inclusive, but that they can go to here in the area. And then of course there are a radical number of evangelical, super conservative, hellfire and brimstone, if you will, churches here.
If somebody isn't familiar with maybe the breadth of what you mean as an ally, how would you define or describe that term?
Yeah, so I have identified kind of 3 levels of allyship. I think folks can be advocates, and then I think folks can be allies, and then I think folks can be accomplices. I consider myself an accomplice. I'll get to that in a second. Advocates, I think, are people who are willing to say, I believe that you have a place in the world, and I will honor that, and I believe that you are made in the image of God and you are made perfectly, and I don't think there's anything wrong with you. But I don't know that I have what it takes to actually do battle for you. Allies are folks that will take it that next step further. They will say, I honor you in the fullness of who you are, and I'll march with you. Like I'll step out and say publicly, like, I believe in them. I'm with them. I fully and wholly affirm everything that they are and everything that they are meant to be. Accomplices, I look at similar to accomplices in a crime. We know exactly what we're getting ourselves into. We know where the landmines are. We know what could blow us up, and we're unashamed about the ways in which we'll go to battle, the ways in which we'll step off the sidewalk into the streets, the ways in which we'll fight, the ways in which we will scream as loud as necessary to make sure that people aren't minimized and people aren't forgotten. I say to people all the time, I'm an accomplice because if I'm not willing to be hit with the exact same stones that people are throwing at my LGBTQIA friends, then I'm not standing close enough and I'm not doing enough work. And so accomplices, from my personal definition, are people that are willing to get hit by the same rocks because they're standing so close to the fight and are engaged so intentionally in the work that they're getting hit before the people that the stones are intended for are getting hit.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of stones, maybe catch us up to date on, for those who aren't familiar with your story, on what this has cost you. You know, I think a number of people, whether they're willing to articulate it or not, people that I connect with, because my background is evangelical and non-denominational and so forth, is there's a desire to want to love and include, but yet there's like, there's a cost, you know, there's a big cost. The cost could be as minimal as, somebody not liking me to losing my job. You know, there's that range of cost. The brokenness of relationship, there's just a cost. So tell us about just an update on what that has cost you in recent months and years.
So for those that don't know me, I was fired by the United Methodist Church on February 28th of this year. I was found in violation of our book of discipline, which is kind of the polity arm of our church, the rules for those of us that are clergy, and the rules for the way in which we are to kind of run our church. Our policy in the United Methodist Church, which I will contend for the rest of my days, is homophobic and full of bigotry, states that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Like, let that sink in for a second. We are a church that allows reconciling ministries to do the work in our world, and yet our discipline says that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And what that statement affords the United Methodist Church the ability to do is say that pastors cannot do a couple of things. We cannot marry same-sex couples. We are not to allow our congregations to host the marriages of same-sex couples, even if we don't preside over them. And if we identify as queer, we cannot be ordained. We cannot proceed in the ordination or the licensing process to become a pastor or a licensed pastor or a deacon in the United Methodist Church. As you'll remember, I pastored 2 predominantly queer congregations, and a couple who I'm very close with, who have been faithful members of this revitalized St. Mark's community, whom I have watched raise their young son together, asked me if I would stand before them and marry them last year. And I said yes. And it was discovered that I did this, and my bishop had my credentials rescinded. Now, I say all that to say I knew the rule. I was not without, I wasn't kind of novice or, had blinders on or, oh, I didn't know, sorry. But I also believe fully that if I'm called to be someone's pastor, then I'm called to be their pastor 365 days a year, in all ways, at all times. My church had given me the authority to baptize them, serve them communion, be with them at their bedside if they or their parents were ill, preside over their funerals should they pass on, be a part of every single life moment as a pastor that these folks would ever engage in, except for one day out of 1 year for their entire life. That's the only time I'm not allowed to be their pastor. And as an accomplice, as someone who is willing to get hit by the rocks, I couldn't do that. I'm asked to perform a whole bunch of weddings of same-sex couples, and by and large, I said no. Because I knew the rules, because I knew what could happen to my livelihood. I had performed 2 weddings out of the multiple dozens that I had been asked to do, because they were integrated members of the community that I had been appointed by my bishop to serve. And so I got caught for one of them. And
was this the same bishop that appointed you, that unappointed you? I know it's not unappointed. What's the correct word?
Yeah, had my credentials rescinded.
Rescinded, yeah. And so how did, and maybe it's not appropriate to go into the conversation, but I'm just trying to, get my mind around that to go, how do you affirm the placement, knowing the vision, the passion, the values, and then not was, obviously was he or she getting pressure from above? Was it, how does that reconcile?
I mean, I can't speak for her. I would suspect that her perspective or her answer to any questions about my firing would be, we honored Anna in her appointment in these congregations. She had full leniency to do absolutely everything that she wanted and needed to do in those congregations to minister to those folks, as long as those things did not break the discipline, which she at her at the time in which she took her vows said she would follow.
Right. And that's
that would be the line. That would be the kind of the corporate line.
Right.
I don't know how she feels about it. She and I have yet to speak.
Okay. All right. So really the disconnect is, as you brought up, the Methodist Church's willingness to allow this reconciling ministries to function and yet not be fully on the same page with what it's doing. That's the disconnect. That's the awkwardness. Yeah. So
it is. And also remember, it's geographical. So there are, I am, you know, in the South. I am in a largely conservative part of the country. The bishops that serve here are largely conservative, or at least rule followers, to the point where they are kind of towing the line for the majority of their parishioners. There are bishops, however, across the country who have chosen not to follow or adhere to the rules, or ask their pastors to adhere to the rules. If I had been a pastor in the United Methodist Church in the Northwest, the Northeast, California, any number of places, my bishop would have fully supported me in what I did. And had someone turned me in or brought me up on charges, the likelihood is that it would have not gotten as far as it did. And so, you know, we're at a real crossroads right now with the United Methodist Church. We are meeting in February of 2019. So in 5 short months, to actually have a called general conference just on this issue. We have been talking about this for 14 years. We have been fighting this battle and trying to work through the change of the discipline for a really long time. And all that it does is continue to hurt the people that we say Jesus is here to be a friend to. And so, you know, my fervent prayer is that in February, the book of discipline will change, at least to the extent that people like me and pastors like me can feel affirmed in the work that they're called to do. If the discipline changes, the likelihood is that I could be reappointed. I can apply for reappointment. I have not been fired for life. My credentials were rescinded. However, if the book of discipline changes, then I could be reappointed to a congregation. I mean, I could apply for reappointment now, but if my bishop asked me, are you going to follow the book of discipline? Are you not going to marry anyone else? I couldn't lie to her. And so right now I really am, you know, I'm not eligible for appointment unless I relocate.
Sure. I want Chirp to jump in here with some questions about the road to Edmond, which is one of the reasons. But I did have one more question for you. I find it interesting. It sounds like you're still attending one of those churches that you pastored. And I was just curious how that works and why you have chosen to do that.
So yeah, I am still attending St. Mark's, which is the church that I was part of the leadership team to revitalize. They are my community, and they have been my community since before I was a pastor. I also begged them not to leave. When this happened, I knew that this would cause irreparable harm for some of the queer folk that I was serving. I mean, they have been turned away and told they are less than their entire lives. And here they finally have communities of faith where they are fully honored and loved. And their straight cisgender pastor is fired because of them. I begged them not to leave. I said, you know, this community, this local church community is no different. We are exactly who we have always been. I may not be in your pulpit, but I am still a part of this community. And I knew that I could not beg of them to stay and be in the midst of this shitstorm unless I modeled for them what that looked like. And it's been painful. There are Sundays where I am full of joy. And there are other Sundays where I cry because I'm, for one reason or another, because I miss them. I miss the work. I miss the ministry. Someone has said something mean to me and I don't feel like I'm welcome. By and large, though that's not the case. If I'm sad, I'm sad because I'm not their pastor anymore. But yeah, I'm traveling more now that I'm not pastoring. I'm trying to supplement, the loss of income with some, other preaching and teaching and speaking things. But when I'm in town, I'm at St. Mark's.
So one of the challenges I think we're at in the church at large, and you mentioned it, that in different parts of the country, just within the Methodist Church, different areas are at different places in this conversation, or at least the critical mass are, right? And as someone who out of this experience has been given the opportunity to facilitate conversations in different communities that are at different places and with different ministers who are at different places, like what have been some of your takeaways for what it's like to converse as communities and for ministers reflecting about their own decisions to be advocates, allies, or accomplices? Like, what does that look like when done well?
When done well, it looks like authenticity, which can be a really crappy buzzword if it's not used right. But I think that, pastors are, look, I get it. There's a fear factor to being yourself or speaking your truth, either on the sideline or from the pulpit. Just as you all illustrated in The Road to Edmond with Pastor Don. He sends Cleo this message saying, like, I'm proud of you. You were brave. I couldn't do that because I can't lose my livelihood. It's a real thing. I get it. These pastors have families and children and pensions, and, it's hard. So I understand why they don't. I also am always going to encourage them to at least be truthful to their own congregations. I have to think that that's where we're getting, especially in the United Methodist Church, because we are now up against a real critical vote in February. Churches are wrestling with who they are, which then requires pastors and other people in leadership in those churches to be truthful about their perspectives. And, some pastors are able to say, I recognize that this congregation doesn't wholly agree with me. However, this would be what I would like to see done in the church. There are other pastors who simply can't get there, just can't get there. And then there are pastors who are adamantly against changing the discipline. In the United Methodist Church, there's a new organization called the Wesley Covenant Association that has formed out of this conversation, and they are hell-bent on not just not changing the discipline, but making the rules stricter, because they believe fully that we aren't doing enough to keep queer folk out of our churches and to keep pastors on a short leash.
So one of the things that strikes me, and having done the podcast for 10 years, I've heard stories and emails and then had phone calls with people from all over the country at different places in their own growth as a minister at coming to understand how they see scripture, how they see God and our bodies and sexuality and diversity and stuff. And then all those ministers are in situations where the very community and people that introduce them to the love of God and Christ are the ones they see resisting the call of that very same God, right? And I think as a more progressive Christian, it's hard to remember what the turmoil is like when the very people who wiped your butt and prayed over you before you could say Jesus are looking at you going, Reverend, I don't know what's going through your head, right? And so one of our goals when we were making the road to Edmond was to let people in on what it's like to be a minister when you don't have answers, not just about sexuality, but about salvation or what the right thing to do is, and how in a lot of cases, your theology's catching up with your fidelity to the Spirit in the present. Or like you're figuring out what the right and loving thing to do is, and you're like, this is what Jesus would do. Now, how does this make sense with my doctrine? And I'm interested in how the actual community of the people you serve, their stories and things brought you through that place of going from being an advocate because of friendships in college. And I'm not going to differentiate us. I want to be with you where you are. We can both grow to, no, like if I can't stand with you on this one day where you're making promises before God and each other that are going to hold true on all the other bad days you call me and the amazing days we celebrate together, then I'm not going to, be here. Like what were the places, experiences, stories like that gave you the confidence as a minister of the gospel to make that movement, that progress, that change?
So I mean, it's all about, as Maya Angelou says, when we know better, we do better, right? And I believe that, people are put in our lives and people are put on our pathways, both to teach us things, but more than that, to be living, breathing versions of the Holy Spirit, to disturb us, to stir us, to force us to think, oh my, I am different than I would have been before in this situation. And so I have had many friends over the years who have found love and have found their partners. And I have watched that happen, and the beauty that, and the God gifted beauty that comes from that. I have lost friends to suicide and to AIDS, and have lamented over what was in their head about God in those final moments. Who did they believe God to be? Or did they even care anymore? And all of those things have formed me, have changed me. I remember, watching closely when my UMC brother, Frank Schaefer, was put on trial for marrying his gay son and his son's husband, and the harm and the hurt and the work that had to be done to repair relationships. And I watched people, even in my own congregations, say, you know what, I love you, I love this place, but I don't support the work we're doing here. And in those cases, my position has always been to radically love them on their way, because there is always going to be another church for somebody like them. There is not going to be another church like St. Mark's or St. Elmo for the large majority of queer folk that have been kicked out of other congregations. And so all of it boils down to relationship. If we look at the work that Jesus did no good work without being in relationship, even if it was simply surface level, with the people that he was ministering to and saving and performing miracles on. It is about our willingness to be intimate with people's stories and with other people that causes us to listen more closely to who they are. And I'm telling you, the number of people that have said to me, I never would have believed that I would have changed my position on gay marriage until I met so-and-so and their partner so-and-so and realized how much like me they really are, how much they're like my wife and I, or my husband and I, or people that have said, I never would have supported a queer identity in any way, shape, or form until my child said to me, I think I might be gay. And they had to discern whether their relationship with their child was more important than the God that they had said they had been following for all of these years. Mm-hmm. And the best of us, the best version of ourselves, hears stories like that or engages in conversations with people in that way and says to ourselves, I owe it to them to learn more or to identify why it is that I'm so uncomfortable with this. Not to say, nope, sorry. That's not what my Bible says. That's not what my preacher taught me. Nope, sorry. I'm done. Like, I'm out. We owe it to people. We owe it to the relationships we have with people to be seekers of knowledge and to be discerners of what we truly believe it is that Jesus taught us. And so it's through those relationships that I think the majority of people change, or at least give themselves the permission to read a little more, mm-hmm. to speak a little more, to say, okay, you know what? I might not change my mind, but I'm going to at least look at some resources, follow some folks on Twitter, and see what happens.
Well, one of the goals we had in making the movie The Road to Edmond is really to create an experience where individuals that have never had the conversation around sexuality or the big questions shaping American religion could have watched the same movie and have that conversation with people that don't all already agree with them, right? So like there are jokes that are will make regardless of where you are in the spectrum wiggle, and through the course of the film you find more and more out about the characters' backgrounds and families, so they become human even though early on they come across as these archetypes conflicting and stuff. And I've had responses from people that facilitated those conversations and from those that are looking forward to it, realizing they may not be actually equipped to have it. So like when in thinking about the film, like, and facilitating conversations that could come out of it, how do you describe, like, how would you describe or encourage being the facilitator the first time someone voices questions, doubts, or suspicions about where they're headed?
Yeah. So a couple of things. The first is that you are not to be the answer giver. You are to be the space holder. And so the best ways in which we facilitate conversations is to allow people to ask questions, but cause conversation that not necessarily gives an answer, but causes other questions to then be raised. I think pastors specifically get themselves in trouble when we try to be the answer givers. I mean, our people expect that of us often, oddly so. I mean, I always find it funny when, parishioners think that we have all the answers. Often we are more confused than they are, simply because we have learned in different ways or learned from other people that have caused us to have more questions than we have answers. But I think facilitating really requires us to not have answers. I love The Road to Edmond because I think it gives it is an open-ended question, right? I mean, I will tell anyone that asks, my biggest challenge with the movie is where it stops. I want to see Cleo talk to that board. I want to see the young girl hug his neck and for her parents to stand up at a public forum and say, like, we're with him. I want that allyship and the accomplishment to be like on display. But I'm with you in knowing that I want that because I am part of conversations and communities, quite frankly, that are already there, that are past it. So many of our communities aren't. And it's in that, not knowing what happens with Cleo and how things turn out for him, that I think gives churches and communities the permission to also say, we don't know what's going to happen with us. We don't know how things are going to turn out for us. We don't know if we are going to change our minds, but we are willing to put ourselves in a space where asking questions and antagonizing each other in loving ways is permitted.
So the way you put that, I think, is so helpful. And I was talking with a church group that showed it, and they literally did not tell everyone at the church they were showing the film. They invited certain people, namely families they know where someone has come out. And we Skyped after it, and someone said the same thing. Like, why don't we see what happens? Like, what does Cleo do? Does he go back? Does he hug him? Blah, 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 blah. And I said, like, well, the thing is, like, everyone that watches this film and has that response is doing it because they actually know someone like the girl in the film that they're supposed to be Cleo for. Right. And too often a film like this, we can resolve the very parts of the art that are provoking, right, the goodness of God out of us. And so that question that we want to see, I think, is a question we don't want so many leaders and parents and grandparents and Sunday school teachers and mentors off the hook from.
Yeah.
Right. Like rather strategically, almost no reason Cleo is a minister or really anything outside of the textual relationship he has with the elders and the minister and Pastor Don. And the only people in his community you see are the parents of the girl and the girl. And they're the only ones who get bodies. But the actual interaction or the act of discipleship of responding is something I think more people who would never say, well, I'm open and affirming, but I feel this is exactly where Christ is sending Cleo response. Right. And
how odd is it that someone as discombobulated as Larry becomes the protagonist, the Jesus kind of needler in Cleo's life, the one that kind of throws at him the one-liners of, there's got to be more. Like, you trust yourself. You have to do what you feel is right. And, these parents want the mentor of their children to love them as much as they love them. And I mean, it's everyone that watches the movie is, if they are authentic, should identify in some way with every single one of the characters. They're going to identify with the elders, being naysayers. They're going to identify with Cleo, being someone who really wants to step out but doesn't have the guts to. They're going to identify with Larry. They're going to identify with the joy that was seen at the wedding. Like, they're going to identify in a lot of different ways. The question then becomes, who are they going to be when it comes to redefining the work that their church needs to do, or that their own small intimate community needs to do in being people that Jesus has called them to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In one of the things that has struck me in encountering or just talking to so many people that have seen the film is, most of the content I create is pretty direct. Like, 90-minute podcast talking to a theologian, there's not a lot of ambiguity about what we're talking about and such. And in realizing that a film has, for a lot of people that are connected to the podcast, become something that they can share to provoke conversations in ways just like, hey, well, let me explain the clobber passages or whatever it is you can't. And I know you backed into ministry as an artist.
Yeah.
So, leaning into your artist side, like, what kind of lessons then do you think the church needs to learn about that? You talked about the art of space holding or creating art that creates space. And are there, I feel like we need to de-Protestantize ourselves a little bit, because Protestants had this clinging to a text, clinging to the literal interpretation, and then any answer or solution is something that, could be put in a syllogism when, if we asked for a syllogism to explain why we love our partners, we're going to fail. And yet, for some reason, our love for God and what that love looks like in community, we need an instruction manual. And I feel like one of the things I've learned in showing the film and talking to people is how much these other mediums, especially something like film or art and things, creates a theological soundscape of sorts that direct communication doesn't.
Yeah. I believe firmly as an artist that we as spiritual beings and as people that lead churches, in many instances, need to find ways to enable spiritual conversations outside of programmed and process-driven activity. So how do we have conversations about spirituality in ways that provoke? And so, one of the things that I've been a part of for the last, I guess it's been 5 years now, is a project called Faith Marks. And Faith Marks is an art show that travels the country that is based on the spirituality of tattoos. And so it's these massive canvases of gorgeous photography of people's ink. And while the pictures are beautiful and speak to us, what's most impactful is the physical story that sits alongside the canvases, where every person who has spiritual ink tells the reason that ink is important to them, that they got what is the story behind it. And it's everything from my grandmother's favorite hymn was "It Is Well With My Soul," and so this is her handwriting. It reminds me of her, and it reminds me of God. To this crown is on my neck because it covers up the gang tattoo that I got when I was 19. To a mother that submitted her son's tattoos. He's covered in gorgeous Christian tattoos, but she submitted his photo and his story because he was killed by a police officer in Alabama, shot in the middle of the street as a brown kid, deemed unworthy of continuing his life. That show provokes. You can put it in a church, you can put it in a community center, you can put it in a university, and people read those stories and they're going to talk about them. And sometimes they're going to talk about the people, and sometimes they're going to talk about the tattoos, but in the grand scheme of things, they're going to still always be talking about God, or Buddha, or Allah, whomever it whatever God it is that they ascribe to. But it is that kind of provoking that's necessary, and we have to do it as artists. I mean, one of the things I love most about The Road to Edmond, especially now that I've watched it the second time, is all of the metaphor and symbolism that's hidden there, that a lot of which I didn't pick up on until the second time, watching it. I feel like I could do an entire study just on metaphor. What is the van a metaphor for? What is the cemetery scene a metaphor for? I mean, I believe the cemetery scene is a premonition of what happens to our queer kids when we aren't able to convince them of their worth. And so, there's so much work that can be done if we start to just deconstruct and break things down, and if we put things in front of people that provoke them into conversation.
Mm-hmm. So one last question for me, and then Dave, you can ask anything to wrap up and stuff. But so who, if people are thinking of screening and showing the film, who do you think the film is for, or who's the ideal group or facilitator for showing the film and using it?
Yeah. So I love that question because I have also been thinking about that. One of the gifts that I have in my life is that the church communities that I'm largely connected with, I don't want to say they don't need the film, but the film isn't going to, I think, kind of accelerate or modify their thinking. They're already there. And so I would love for, specifically in my denomination, for youth ministers of post-evangelical but not yet progressive congregations to say, I believe that this is the right next step for my kids. And I would love for, Sunday school classes, that Sunday school class of 30 somethings that has teenagers, to say, you know what, this would be a great thing for us to do. Let's get together one Friday night at somebody's house and screen this movie. Bring your kids or don't bring your kids. Turn it into a family event or don't. As much as I love the thought of whole congregations watching the film, I'm a firm believer that this kind of work that we're doing is most impactfully done in smaller team-based work. And so while I would never discourage a pastor from saying, we're going to show the movie on our big screens in the sanctuary Friday night, come watch it, go for it. I love that. But then also gift it to your Sunday school classes, gift it to your youth group, ask them to watch it and engage in it deeply and authentically and honestly, and see what comes from that. I would also really love for gay straight alliances in high schools to watch it, because I think that there are so many teenagers who believe that the gospel is not, will never be again for them. They are out of church. They are not interested. And I would love for this kind of medium to be a gift for them, to affirm the ways in which folks like us believe without question that the gospel is theirs for the taking, and that the Jesus that we know and the God that we serve is one that radically loves them exactly as they are. And so if I were to try to get the film into the hands of folks that I thought needed it, that's where I'd start.
And I had the chance, the opportunity to meet you and watch you speak a couple of weeks ago at Theology Beer Camp in North Carolina. And I was just deeply impressed by your gift of provoking. You are I know you use that word quite a bit, in a needler, and everybody's not necessarily has the personality that you do, but I think everybody can do what you said, which was, for the sake of this other person that I'm getting to know or have a relationship with, I should look more deeply. I should learn more, rather than that's not what my Bible says, that's not what my pastor says. That is so powerful that it's just like, you know what, for the sake of relationship, for the sake of this other human being that God has created, they deserve me to look into this a bit more. They deserve me to do some more research. And I just appreciate that thought, because I know so many people who don't have a relationship with people who would identify as queer, and yet have such a strong stance against it. And yet there is no relationship, or no willingness to ask questions or look deeper or read a simple book on the subject. So I love that. I admire what you're doing. If people want to get to know you more or follow your work, what would be the best place for them to connect with you?
So I have a public Facebook page, Anna Golladay. You can get the spelling of that on the Facebook Live feed. I share a lot of my work there. I have a blog, Unholy Heretic, and it's unholy and hair, Hair, etic. And that's actually where you can find me on Twitter too, at Unholy Heretic. And the dates and locations of where I'll be speaking and where I'll be doing work are listed on my website. And I'll be traveling both alone and with the Activist Theology Project over the next, couple of months. And so we're trying to do the good work. It's not easy being a provocateur. It's not easy making people uncomfortable. It's not easy, getting fired, but it's necessary. And I'm lucky enough that my privilege gives me the ability to do it in a way that others may not.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who do want to screen the film, or we even have the film available in what we're calling a VIP access experience. It includes a 4-week video course. It makes you feel special. Yes, it does. But you get a 4-part video course that Tripp has put together on the Bible and sexuality, where we unpack some of these ideas. Plus you get the film, and that is available for you to stream for forever online. And you can check all of that out at theroadtoedmond.com, THE road to Edmond. I have so many people say Edmonton in person, and I just want to strangle them. But I choose not to. This is not about Canada. Okay. This is Oklahoma, the road to Edmond. activism.com. And you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So, Anna,
and
thanks
become an associate producer, y'all. Become an associate producer. You
Yes.
just give these fine folks the money that they deserve for the film that they created. For $100, you can become an associate producer and get your name on the film and on the website and on IMDb. Like it's a good thing. Do it.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, I really feel like that last bit. I mean, I resonate. I teared up a little bit, but that last bit, I really feel like the Holy Ghost is touching everyone that's watching right now. Figure out how to be an associate producer. Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for hanging out.
Also she is also a provocateur. That Holy Spirit.
Oh yeah, very dangerous. If you're only going to listen once this month, now's your opportunity.
Check it off the list.
All righty. Peace.
Thanks, friends. It was good to chat with you. Thanks for having me.
All righty. Bye.
Bye.